Every once in a while, a plugin comes along that is marketed as the secret sauce that is going to give you the edge on the competition. And this year has been no exception. All over YouTube land, I have seen videos claiming that Metric Halo's Mixhead tape saturator is the key to Serban Ghenea's mixes, and because Serban Ghenea used the hardware, this means that having this on your MIXBUS is going to make you as good as Serban. The truth is, Mixhead is not special. There is no secret sauce, and you can actually get its main purpose for free, and I'm gonna prove it. Mixhead in its primary function is nothing more than a very simple, straightforward wave shaper. Now, wave shapers have been used on MIXBUSes for decades to achieve more perceived loudness via abusing distortion and clipping. This popularity started with the infamous Sonic's inflator, which I and others have proved to be nothing more than a standard wave shaper. Now, many will be asking, how is it I know that Mixhead in its primary function is nothing more than a basic wave shaper? It's actually very easy to prove. If we first load up Mixhead into Plugin Doctor, we can see that the plugin has a non-linear transfer curve with a very gentle knee. This is what we find in most wave shapers, as they are commonly used to shape the wave in a way that introduces soft clipping, which gently compresses the signal as it reaches the threshold. Soft clipping will create less distortion than hard clipping, and the interaction of the signal with the transfer curve is dependent on the amplitude of the input signal. So the hotter your input signal, the more gentle compression and subtle harmonics is brought in by the soft clipping, and dependent on your maximum peaks and where your output threshold is set, you can add in heavier compression and more distortion as the signal peaks past the threshold. This is why saturators and clippers have become very popular in mixing, as they can create more headroom for the final limiter. The harmonic distortion caused by the compression of the peaks not only means that the final limiter doesn't have to work as hard as the input signal is less varied in its peaks, but it also creates more perceived loudness, which is a technique that has been abused for as long as I can remember, especially in the world of the loudness wars. But how do we prove that Mixhead is just a very standard wave shaping algorithm and there's nothing special going on? Well, let's add our old friend Melda MSaturator, which is free by the way. If you load in its default setting, bring the analog down to 0, which is essentially the noise, and match the input gain, we can see that the transfer curves line up almost identically. From what I can tell, Mixhead uses symmetrical non-linearities, possibly polynomial wave shaping, as it's really only odd harmonics, which as you can see match MSaturator very closely, with the first odd order of harmonic being near identical. Now, what's important to bear in mind here is that Plugin Doctor shows all the way down to minus 200 dB full scale. Now, we are lucky if we can hear harmonic content below minus 70 to minus 80 dB full scale. So in reality, the only harmonics to keep an eye on is really the first and second orders of harmonic. But in reality, mostly that first order of harmonic. As you can see, their attack and release curves also prove that the compression being had is due primarily to the wave shaping. Now, you will notice that Mixhead is gold in this particular setting. This is because it is using the preset that this plugin is being so heavily marketed on, which is
SG, the one.
SG standing for Serban Ghenea. Now, as I've shown, the harmonics and non-linear transfer curve are near identical. So what's actually the difference between the two? Well, the only difference that I could find is the high frequency adjust, which is set to 1 in the Serban preset. This is adding what looks like a dB bell at 15 kHz with a Q of around 0.6. Now, what's interesting is that this high frequency adjust function uses linear phase filtering. Now, this pickled me silly for a couple of days, as the pass-through of the plugin, so no high frequency adjust, shows as linear. Basically flat via the linear test. But when passed through Doctor's fundamental sweep, which caters for non-linearities, it shows a 1 dB dip at around 15 kHz, which is essentially kind of corrected when you add in the 1 dB linear phase 15 kHz boost in the Serban preset. Now, this isn't just Serban's preset. I noticed that in most MIXBUS presets, the high frequency adjust was set to 1. This makes me think that Metric Halo have made a conscious effort to intentionally counter for whatever is causing this 15 kHz dip. It's baffling because my suspicion is that this dip is due to some form of linear phase processing, which is why they have made the high frequency adjust linear phase on purpose. From what I have read, now this isn't concrete, but from what I've read, I'm not entirely sure if the hardware DSP used linear phase filtering with the high frequency adjust. It read to me that it was minimum phase and used more like a standard high frequency EQ. But without having the hardware, I may be wrong. But it's just very odd either way, as there is no linear phase in analog. So it would baffle me as to why the SPL machine head DSP would utilise linear phase filtering, but maybe there's something I'm missing, but I don't care. Because when I nulled Serban's preset with and without the high frequency adjust on a mix, with a true peak of minus 5.5 dB full scale, I couldn't get the null with the 1 dB high frequency adjust to add even 0.1 dB of a difference with the original mix. So as much as it adds a very, very, very subtle difference, it is a difference that in reality, only a dog can hear. Now, before we get into the audio nulls, I just want to say that this plugin just feels like an inside joke in so many ways. The power button simply turns off and on a power glow animation and doesn't actually function as a power button. The input and drive do the exact same thing. They are just simply clean linear gain. Now, why they didn't just make this one input dial completely baffles me, but just to prove what I mean, I'll show you a null and I'll switch between two settings, A and B. A is the Serban preset with minus 2 dB input gain and plus 1.6 dB drive gain, and B is the input gain set to minus 0.4 dB, which would be the input of A if you added the 1.6 dB of drive gain to the minus 2 dB of input gain. And as you can hear and see, there is no change to the delta signal. Both simply add clean gain. So to show you what the transfer curve is actually doing, let's null Serban's Mixhead preset with a mix with only 0.2 dB full scale of headroom. If I push any more, it'll start clipping the master fader. Now, I've purposely printed the null so you can see and also hear. And as you can hear, what we have left is from the transient shaving caused by the soft clipping. In this instance, we can hear the difference that occurs when adding in distortion and gentle compression via soft clipping. Right, so with that out of the way, if we set the high frequency adjust in Mixhead to 0 and set our input in MSaturator to match that of Mixhead, we will get this null on the same mix with only 0.2 dB full scale of headroom.
Can't see your face, but she knows your name. On my fingertips, deeper and deeper, I could learn to live with this. I separate my feelings, pretend.
And as you can see, the level nearly drops completely from the bus fader, and as you can hear, the null is completely imperceivable. That horrible distortion and clipping that we heard in the last delta has essentially disappeared from our audible range because the transfer curves on both are doing essentially the exact same job. Now, I may get many moaning that I've not pushed the mix into hard clipping, and that's the real sound of this plugin. Just to put some context into this, John Haynes, Serban's assistant of many decades, confirmed on Gearspace that the hardware unit was used very subtly, not intentionally hitting it harder for effect. That is why the output of Serban's preset, which if we remember also acts as the threshold for hard clipping, is set at 1.2 dB, which is basically 0 dB full scale. This means that Serban was only using the unit for very gentle peak shaving before the second stage of compression, which I'll take a guess is the limiter. So essentially, he was using a soft clipper after the 2-bus compression to shave off any transients that had escaped through the first stage of compression. It's an extremely common technique, one that I was taught from my mentors, and that's genuinely all it is. But for those complainers, here is the same mix with near zero headroom, but with 4 dB additional input gain in both plugins. Also bear in mind that both signals are 4 dB louder, so the null itself will be 4 dB louder by default.
Can't see your face, but she knows your name. On my fingertips, deeper and deeper. I could learn to live with this. I'm still. Feelings pretend, but I've been.
And for those complaining that Serban's preset is using the 15 IPS setting, let me tell you that the 30 IPS setting is the 15 IPS, but with the output decreased by minus 1.3 dB and the input raised by 1.3 dB. 30 IPS is basically the hard clipping threshold brought down by minus 1.3 dB but compensated in level via the input. The harmonics are practically identical and it's as simple as that. Now the 3.5 IPS setting is the only thing that makes this plugin different. Gives you a bit of a lo-fi tape frequency response with a low bump and high-end dip, but its transfer curve is basically 15 IPS with the output threshold set minus 2.2 dB lower. Harmonics remain basically audibly identical, so really it's just the same wave shaping parameters but with an optional EQ. Mixhead does not come with oversampling as far as I'm aware, which means that it does suffer from audible aliasing when pushed, where if you set MSaturator to say ×4, you will get pretty much flat with super high quality linear phase oversampling. And mostly all of the aliasing is kept below the audible threshold. Obviously that's dependent on how hard you push the plugins because they all have a limit. However, if you do wish to push MSaturator even harder, you've got ×8, you've got ×16, you've got ×32, it goes all the way up. It's ridiculous. So you've got all the options in there to push this plugin hard whilst keeping aliasing to a minimum. And that's it. No secrets, no big discoveries, no game changers, just a simple wave shaping algorithm that can be achieved with a free Melda plugin that can actually offer you more options than this overpriced wave shaper. No doubt there are other free wave shapers out there that can do the same thing and much more, but at the end of the day, it's nothing special and it's a technique that has been used for decades. So my advice is save your money, try soft clipping with Melda on the 2-bus before your limiter, and if it's not for you, then don't do it. I personally clip on tracks and buses, others don't do it at all, others do it on the 2-bus. Just experiment and do what sounds right for you, and we'll park it there. My name is Paul Third, and I'll see you whenever I see you.